Hey again. Did you know that Titanfall 2 is a Source game? Well, if you've seen any marathon runs of the game from the last, 5 years, you probably know because...
What you might not know about Titanfall 2 is that it runs on a modified version of the Source engine.
Modified version.
Heavily modified Source engine?
Source engine?
Source engine.
Source engine.
Source engine.
Source engine.
Source engine.
Yeah, it's basically the number one fun fact about Titanfall 2 that every speedrunner wants to be the first to tell you. And for good reason, because it's kind of a big deal considering that most speedruns of Source engine games tend to look kind of ridiculous. Source games are pretty much the cream of the crop when it comes to FPS games with cool movement mechanics, and the iconic pieces of movement tech associated with Source runs have an incredibly deep history rooted all the way back in the Quake engine, which was reused and adapted many times over the course of many projects. From the Quake engine to Gold Source over to Source and Source 2, there were obviously many changes even within the basic movement mechanics, but the fundamental controls that gave birth to bunny hopping and air strafing stayed, meaning that these mechanics could be studied and perfected by speedrunners over the course of decades, making them some of the most recognizable bits of speedrun tech out there. So, if you're not super familiar with Titanfall, it might come as a surprise to you that it shares these same bits of tech in combination with all of the sliding and wall running you can do on top of that. The mix of these mechanics is what creates arguably one of the deepest movement systems of any modern FPS game out there. And if you don't believe me, the resources compiling all of the movement tech in Titanfall include both a 10-page glossary filled with definitions, along with a 40+ minute guide explaining how to perform most of them. The specific version of the Source engine that Titanfall uses has so many interesting mechanics and quirks that it either inherits from previous iterations, or are unique to this version that it could probably fill out multiple PhDs and 7-hour video essays, so today I'm going to focus on just one quirk that's unique to the Titanfall engine and how it has evolved to be one of the most important movement mechanics for speedrunners and competitive players that now the majority of all commonly used techniques are based around. So, let's talk about Strafe-Lurch. Okay, so first off, what even is Strafe-Lurch? As the theory goes, when the devs at Respawn were working on the player movement, they realized that the Source engine controls don't really lend themselves well to controlling yourself in the air if you don't have like 700 hours on surf maps. So, as a helping hand for new players, they implemented a mechanic that they likely internally called the jump keyboard grace period. This is the mechanic that would be dubbed Strafe-Lurch by the community, so I'm going to be referring to it as that instead of this comically long dev name. At a fundamental level, Strafe-Lurch allows you to make quick, small corrections of your mid-air trajectory by just hitting the direction you want to go in directly after jumping. Sounds simple enough, but there are actually 4 different variables that each influence a different part of how it actually works in the game. Jump keyboard grace period max defines how long after a jump the mechanic will stay active. By default, it's set to 0.5, meaning 0.5 seconds in the game. So if you press a movement key in any direction within that half second after jumping, you will get a lurch pointing in that direction. Jump keyboard grace max and jump keyboard grace strength both define how Strafe-Lurch is actually applied to your movement. Max defines the upper limit of how strong the overall change in velocity can be, and strength defines the angle of the lurch based on your input direction. The way these two work together and the way they're tuned makes it so that you lose a bit of speed every time you lurch, creating a bit of a trade-off between maneuverability and speed. Jump keyboard grace period min has arguably the least noticeable effect, because it affects the drop-off in strength over time. Generally, the later you press the movement key, the weaker the effect of the lurch will be. You would think this is a simple linear drop-off, but grace period min actually fixes the strength to its max value for 0.2 seconds, after which it drops off normally. Another fun tidbit is that, for whatever reason, the strength hits 0 after 0.4 seconds, instead of the half second you might expect. So in practice, the actual lurch window you have during gameplay is just a bit less than half a second. Okay, so that's most of the technical details out of the way, so let's now take a look at how all of this knowledge even came to be and why speedrunners need to know this kind of stuff, because this mechanic has actually been the centerpiece driving a whole lot of discussions about input methods and input emulation. Now, when I'm talking about input methods, I'm specifically referring to keyboard and controller as different ways to play the game, and how the differences between the two affect movement and speedrunning. Case in point, Strafe-Lurch. One thing you may have been able to deduce by looking at the variables' names is that it was seemingly only built for keyboard inputs, and you'd be completely wrong, actually. Well, kind of. Specifically, Strafe-Lurch actually only appears when the movement is being controlled through digital inputs instead of analog ones. For context, digital inputs are ones that only ever send one of 2 values, either on or off. This is, for example, your keyboard buttons, but it's also things like the face buttons and D-pad on your controller. Analog inputs, on the other hand, send a wide range of different values. This is your analog sticks and also triggers on your controller. For our purposes though, we can think of the keyboard as a digital input device and the controller as an analog input device, even though it also has digital buttons, which will definitely not become important later on. The presence and absence of Strafe-Lurch for digital and analog inputs is by far the biggest difference between keyboard and controller when it comes to movement and speedrunning, and due to this they feel fundamentally different to play on. Not in the way that they're just different physical objects, but because the game literally behaves differently depending on what you use to play it. Beginning with the early history, keyboard and controller movement have to some extent always been known to feel different, without anyone being able to pinpoint exactly why that was the case, beyond the obvious differences in how moving and looking around works. It didn't take too long though for speedrunners playing on keyboard to find out about Strafe-Lurch intuitively, simply from playing the game and experiencing it when trying to air strafe. Because you're open to get lurched every time you jump, it's not exactly a shy mechanic that tries to hide itself. Especially if you try playing the game like any other Source game, where it's optimal to switch strafe directions about 10 million times per jump to get the perfect line. Strafe-Lurch was seen by speedrunners as a mechanic that punishes you with speed loss and an awkward change in direction if you start strafing too early after a jump, and one that should be avoided as much as possible because of that. The way this was done at first was by simply waiting out the half-second lurch period after every jump so that one could start a strafe or switch strafe directions without incurring any of that speed loss. Slide-ups, for example, were done in such a way that you only switch strafe directions right before a jump to ensure being well outside of the lurch period from the previous jump. When kicking off of a wall, however, having to wait that half-second before you could start strafing meant that a lot of jumps that included crossing large gaps like heatsink skip or river jump were much more difficult because of the limited amount of time you would be able to strafe. Because the act of air strafing actually gains you speed, you will always get more distance out of a jump by strafing rather than going in a straight line, as counterintuitive as that may seem. And while keyboard players cried in pain, controller players both on console and PC never experienced this, and never had to deal with avoiding Strafe-Lurch, so people quickly became wise to the fact that the game did behave differently depending on what you used to play it. You could very much argue that controller players had a pretty significant advantage over keyboard players in this regard. Because they never experienced lurch to begin with, they have the freedom to strafe for the entire time that they're airborne. For any wall kick double jump combo, that's a full extra second of strafe time that keyboard players just didn't have access to, meaning that controller players were able to gain a lot more speed from simply being able to air strafe more. And that extra speed adds up very quickly due to the momentum-based nature of Titanfall 2 as a speedrun. The only consolation for keyboard players was the developer-intended ability to make small corrections after a jump, which doesn't really mean all that much when the alternative is just, not being slow. And there were really not a lot of places where these corrections could be used to gain an actual advantage over just gaining more speed via strafing. The place where this controller superiority showed itself the most was in the Gauntlet leaderboards, where controller players like Cash Mayo and Vadim were holding top times way above what most keyboard players could accomplish. This sort of status quo would remain until around July of 2019. This is when the first major developments around Strafe-Lurch began hitting the speedrun community. And that was the realization that it's possible to lurch multiple times in a single jump, as long as all the inputs are within the lurch timer. Out of this knowledge, a technique known as Tapstrafing emerged, with players from the competitive community like Reginals being some of the first to adapt this technique and really bring it into widespread use. The term Tapstrafing is now more widely known through Apex Legends, the more popular game. Tapstrafing completely revolutionized how keyboard players moved in spaces that required tight and precise movement around corners. Before this point, people had already been using Strafe-Lurch for small corrections and cutting slightly tighter corners in a few places, but Tapstrafing really opened up a lot of new possibilities because for the first time, runners were able to take control of Strafe-Lurch and manipulate it exactly how they wanted. But why is making these sharp turns with Tapstrafing so good now? Well, Source games have a variable called air acceleration, which is effectively just how the engine handles air control. Due to the way the movement physics are calculated, air acceleration is actually what makes it possible to air strafe, and the higher the value for it is, the quicker you can turn in the air using air strafing. Classic Source games usually have a pretty high value for this, but Titanfall 2 comparatively has a much lower value, which means your turn rate for air strafing is capped much lower, and it only gets worse the faster you go. So you can imagine how limiting this turn rate becomes when you're playing the game with the goal of going as fast as possible, and this is where the power of Tapstrafing becomes apparent. The way it's performed is by first strafing in a direction, and then repeatedly tapping forward to get lurched to the side that you're strafing. And now you might ask, well hang on, I thought Strafe-Lurch was applied in the direction of the button that you pressed, so why would tapping forward lurch you to the side? And that's a good question. The reason this works is because when applying lurch, the game doesn't actually care about which exact button you pressed, because what it checks for is the overall direction that you're holding at that moment. So when you're holding right and tapping forward, for example, the game ends up reading a diagonal forward-right input and applies the lurch accordingly. By holding a side direction and mashing your forward key, you can trigger as many diagonal lurches as you want within half a second, giving a big middle finger to Titanfall's low air acceleration in the process. And this is what tapstrafing does. The trade-off here is, of course, that you lose a bit of speed on every lurch. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the trade-off between maneuverability and speed is one of Strafe Lurch's core properties. We can actually go one step further in abusing lurch by changing the direction that they point in. Instead of holding a side direction and tapping forward to get a 45-degree lurch, we can just tap the side direction repeatedly to get 90-degree lurches. This is what's called fizzy strafing, named after the runner who developed it. This method allows for much sharper changes in direction, but also loses more speed on every lurch, because both the change in direction and the speed loss are proportional to the angle that the lurch is pointed. So now, keyboard players had a much more useful way of abusing strafe lurch, and the versatility of tap strafing is ultimately what made it so powerful. Controller players were looking like they were in danger of falling behind, as they couldn't replicate these sharp turns on their analog sticks. However, if you played with a controller on PC, you had an ace up your sleeve, and it was called using external software. Using programs like JoyToKey, you could rebind the face buttons on the controller to keyboard buttons like WASD, making it possible to tap strafe on controller. Remember when I told you the digital buttons on the controller wouldn't become important? I lied. Sorry. In theory, this was exactly the thing that controller players needed to catch up to the possibilities that playing on a keyboard allowed. In practice, however, having to use external tools to rebind buttons and having to switch into an uncomfortable claw grip to tap strafe made it so that it didn't find very widespread use among speedrunners at first. Not to mention that it was also exclusive to PC, so the trend of console players getting the short end of the stick goes back pretty far. Considering the possibilities for movement though, keyboard and controller were on a pretty even playing field now. Keyboard players were able to trade some speed to make tighter turns, and controller players were able to generally maintain more speed over slower turns, and could still tap strafe if the runner was willing to rebind their digital face buttons. This, again, in theory, meant that controllers still maintained a small advantage over keyboard, even if that advantage wasn't being utilized very heavily. And then August of 2019 happened, which marked one of the most volatile chapters in the history of Titanfall's speedrun community. It was the month of the, among runners, infamous lurch controversy. It began when runner Fizzy started playing around with emulation software that would mask digital keyboard inputs as analog inputs. He realized that strafe lurch was completely gone, even though he was still using a keyboard to play the game. So immediately, all of the differences between how controller and keyboard felt made perfect sense, and it became clear that strafe lurch was exclusive specifically to digital inputs. Now it was understood exactly why controller movement was generally so much more smooth and keyboard movement much more sharp and erratic. And when playing without lurch on keyboard, inputs become much more about flow rather than order of execution. But the reason this became known as such a controversy is because it sparked a huge discussion about whether this emulation software should be allowed for runs. Brian Otto made a video documenting this whole discussion right after it took place, which I definitely recommend watching if you want a more in-depth look at how the community went about this. After a lot of very civil discourse, the community ended up voting to ban digital to analog emulation and vice versa. So what the community ended up taking from this, aside from sharpening their debate skills, is the definitive knowledge of how the game handles these different input methods and how it affects strafe lurch as a whole. And this would ultimately set up everything we would need to know for the next major step to fully understanding lurch. Fast forward to March 2020. This is when the last piece of the puzzle for keyboard players was found that completely changed how the game was played again. Nearly every core piece of movement tech got a fresh new coat of paint by the name of No-Lurch movement tech, and most of these developments were spearheaded, again, by Fizzy, who at this point, thanks to his central role within the lurch controversy and hands-on experience with input emulation, was light years ahead in how much he understood about strafe lurch. The principle behind all of this new tech comes from the fact that the game only ever applies strafe lurch to your movement when you press a movement key, and not when you release it. The idea is that when we want to strafe after a jump, we need to make sure that during the jump we're already holding the button corresponding to which way we want to strafe. Depending on what kind of jump you're doing, the exact technique differs slightly, but it's all still based on the same principle of holding the strafe key before the jump and then letting go of any keys that obstruct strafing after it. The simplest of these is the no-lurch variant of the wall jump. Wall jumps in general require a forward input in order to gain speed from it, and in order to strafe after it, you need to hit a side direction. But while you're still on the wall, you can hit either strafe direction and not suffer any lurch, meaning you can hit it right before jumping and then let go of the forward input right after the jump. This then allows you to start strafing instantly without getting any lurch. And this technique also applies to all of the extended speed tech inherited from the wall jump, like wall kicks, edge boosts, and end boosts. Wall kicks being the most timing sensitive wall tech due to having to jump off of the wall immediately can actually be messed up by hitting a side direction when approaching the wall. Holding into the wall will pull you into it more sharply, and holding away from it can sometimes make you not grab the wall at all. So wall kicks actually have another more advanced variant called a neutral strafe kick, which avoids both of these problems by holding both left and right in addition to forward, so that the left and right inputs cancel each other out to become a neutral input. And by doing this, you can then also strafe in either direction after the wall kick from the exact same inputs. The act of holding both left and right to make a neutral input is also used for the No-Lurch version of the double jump. Because a neutral double jump simply maintains your speed, the forward input isn't even necessary, so just holding left and right and letting go of one of the keys to start strafing works out perfectly. Making this neutral input is also beneficial because it takes advantage of the same principle as tap strafing and how the game reads your inputs. If you press the button within the lurch timer of the previous jump, the game will still try to apply lurch on your key press, but because you're then holding a neutral input, the direction that the lurch is applied in is perfectly in line with the direction you're going, meaning the lurch doesn't actually change your movement. So it's possible to switch strafe directions at any point, as long as there is at least one frame during the switch where both the left and right key are being held. Okay, I think you're getting the idea of how massive this discovery was, because it effectively obsoleted every bit of speed tech that involved jumping. So the new No-Lurch variants just became the standard way of doing things, and the frankly a bit unwieldy prefix fell somewhat out of use in general discourse. This of course doesn't mean that the regular variants don't have their place. In fact, they're still extremely useful if you intend to follow up the jump with a tap strafe, because you get one extra lurch for free when starting the strafe, allowing you to make tighter corners with fewer deliberate inputs. Since these discoveries all apply exclusively to keyboard players, it may seem like they now have a huge leg up over controller players, but it's not quite that black and white in my opinion. If we think about what you can achieve on both, it's pretty much the same. You can do both lurchless movement and tap strafe on both input methods. The difference now is that you get lurchless movement on controller for free, but tap strafing is somewhat inaccessible and awkward. And keyboard players have easier access to tap strafing while also being able to do lurchless movement but having to learn specific tech for it. And that's about the state of things for runners today. So, what's next? So far, everything I've been talking about is just how Strafe has been seen in relation to how humans play around it. But there is a whole separate world within speedrunning where what is humanly possible doesn't matter. I'm of course talking about tool-assisted speedruns, which in Titanfall completely destroy the movement. And Strafe is a surprisingly big part of that, which makes sense because if we look into the tools that were developed for tassing Titanfall, we see a familiar name. Strafe is abused in the task in two very special ways. Most obviously, making these kinds of ridiculous turns with zero speed loss. These strafes take advantage of a specific property of the relation between the angle of the lurch and its resulting speed loss. I mentioned earlier that the angle of the lurch relative to where you're going is proportional to both the change in direction and speed loss. However, there is a small range of angles where this doesn't apply. A lurch pointed up to 25 degrees to either side of the velocity direction will trigger the normal change in direction, but without any speed loss. It's possible to get these very small lurches by aligning your camera to be slightly off to one side and spamming the forward key. And of course, by using timescale to slow the game down and letting the tools hit the forward key as many times as the game can handle, these kinds of dummy shark turns are the result, and they are used all throughout Titanfall's tasks. On the other side of the spectrum, the relation between the angle and speed loss can be used to maximize exactly that, speed loss. The way to do that is with the lurch pointed directly backwards, which will lose the most possible speed without throwing you off your current trajectory. And of course, the task can take that to its theoretical limit and come to a complete stop in the air pretty much instantly. Obviously, these kinds of techniques shown in tool-assisted speedruns like this will never be humanly possible. But they do show the ridiculous potential that this seemingly small little helper mechanic called jump keyboard grace period can have. And even if that potential won't be reached by humans, both it and the tech surrounding it have absolutely become staples of Titanfall 2 speedrunning, and they've made the game's movement that much more fun and interesting.